It's not like there's some manuscript that we know of that links Liber Iuratus spirits to some Persian manuscript or other Arabic source or something. That has not been discovered. There is no real official link between the two. But I don't think it's a bold opinion to state that the spirits are the same.
Greetings and marhaba to AHM Podcast, where we aim to make magic more accessible and bridge the gap between traditions by seeking understanding from scholars and magicians. We come to you with an episode packed full of valuable and practical information, and it's all to your benefit, our dear listener. Our guest today is a reputable traditional magician, a teacher of magic, and I personally think an all-around nice guy, Mr. Adley Nichols. Adley, thank you for accepting my invitation. I'm personally thrilled to have you on today. We have a lot to cover, so without further ado, let us dive straight into the questions. First off, let's start with you telling us a bit more about your experience in magic and the path that led you on to your current practice.
Sure. Well, it was a long road. So I guess it all started, around 2009. And I was just kind of looking for something with some structure. And so I started looking at formal traditions, my wife and I together, actually. And we had found two methods. One is a traditional Gardnerian craft or Gardnerian Wicca, which that's Gerald Gardner's baby from like the 40s, which is very Solomonic influenced, though its own creature in its own way, and Ordo Templi Orientis. So those journeys started around the same time, but it was probably 2 or 3 years later, after really exploring that I started being drawn into Enochian magic, which isn't a surprise with the OTO side of things. A lot of people like the Enochian stuff, and I was starting to get into it. So I built myself a table and acquired the tools and pretty much started just off of, the normal books that you find at the store, which in most cases, those are kind of this neo-Enochian, you might say, where it kind of takes what the Golden Dawn found and tried to recreate. So it wasn't necessarily what you find in the journals. And a few years after practicing, about 4 years after practicing kind of this neo system, I started to realize that these journals had a whole bunch of different stuff in them, and a full system kind of was there. And there was some clashing in my mind between what some of the modern stuff was doing. By modern, I mean Golden Dawn, which I know is not modern by our standards, but definitely more recent than John Dee. And so I decided that I would kind of scratch everything I knew and start it by the book. So I rebuilt everything to the specifications in John Dee's journal. A sweet wood table, the gold consecrated ink for the letterings, a 6x6 inch square in the middle, as opposed to just whatever, you want. The paper talisman instead of like a gold metal one that you find out on Etsy everywhere. So I'm very much a traditional person. And so when I find a tradition, I try to dive into that tradition and try to get rid of some of the assumptions made. Long story short, I wind up rebuilding everything and make better connections with the 7 primary archangels. And there's some debate to the Enochian system. John Dee was looking for a way to speak with angels, and that's basically the origin of the table. And while it involves a whole bunch of angels that are specific to its system, it definitely can contact angels of all sorts. And so I started, I guess, a relationship, say I use that word loosely, with the 7 standard planetary angels. And I would do workings with them rather than like the Heptarchy or any of the other angels that you find on the Sigillum de Myth and stuff like that. And while working with them for a couple of years, I found a system that worked well because I was younger at the time, less stable, mid-level job. Yeah, I needed the normal stuff. I had a house, I had a wife, I needed more money, the usual stuff. And that's not what the system seems to be geared towards. It seems to be geared towards much bigger social change. But I would ask for certain things, and what happened is the angels would deliver a spirit under them and accomplish the task. So there was like this hierarchy to it. And after a couple of years of working this way, it was Michael who told me to stop. He's like, paraphrasing here, of course, but basically saying this is not what this system's for. The gist was, if you're going to work this way by calling spirits to me, under me, you need to work the Heptameron. And at the time, surprisingly, I didn't know what the Heptameron was. Like, I knew the name, but I didn't own the fourth book of occult philosophy, which is where it was. I was not informed about it really at all. So that meant very little to me. So what I did get was the Enochian system wasn't for what I wanted to do. So instead of learning the Heptameron and digging into that, I actually learned the Key of Solomon and worked with that for a few years. And just personally with moderate success. I'd say less success than the Enochian system, but it seemed to be geared more towards working with spirits and angels. But in the end, through my research of the Key of Solomon and practice of the Key of Solomon, I did wind up learning more about the Heptameron, and decided, once I realized that it's all about angels and their authority over spirits, kind of a summary there that's not entirely accurate, but we'll get to that, I'm sure. But I realized that that's what I was doing in the Enochian system. The angels would come and say, well, this isn't really the thing that I'm going to do. So instead, I'm going to bring someone who's more efficient to make sure that they do it. And they'd bring a spirit. And that's exactly what the Heptameron appeared to be doing, was angels delivering spirits. And it made sense. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I should explore this. So I dove in a little bit there and started practicing to the best of my ability. And I realized that there's more to this. So I wound up deciding that I would create a Facebook group and kind of document my journey and deep dive into the Heptameron. And what's amazing about this, to me anyway, is that in working the Heptameron, there were messages being delivered to me. I was being told to do certain things. There was a specific person that I was supposed to gain the trust of, because there was something in that relationship related to the Heptameron. And so I started speaking with them in depth. And I mean, we talk now, like every day we talk, and we're really good friends. But what manifested of that was an elucidarium, which is the predecessor to the Heptameron. He knew somebody who, in brief passing, was speaking about some other Heptameron that was out there. And so he reached out to him, and we got that in the hands of Joseph H. Peterson. And from there, been two other deep dives of elucidariums, which predate the Heptameron. And when I say predate, like one of them was 10 years after the Heptameron's publication, but it's very clear that it was accurately copied from a much earlier source. So we're all dealing within about 100 years of that Heptameron. But we started learning that this whole other thing existed, and it goes way back. And we've discovered more about the system documented in the Heptameron than we knew before.
I was aware that the Elucidarium is predecessor to the Heptameron, but I never knew that there were, different versions, dated a couple, what did you say, a decade between them?
I mean, you've got, VRL 1115 is dated 1569. The Heptameron of the fourth book is 1559. But there's much to say about the copy of this 1569 edition. Wow. That predates the Heptameron, and many different things, like basing the day beginning at sunset versus sunrise, the name corruptions or lack thereof, rather. The Heptameron's not, it was intentionally modified to some degree well, for a few probably political or religious reasons, but yeah, and then we found earlier manuscripts we could see as well that, these checked out to be indeed earlier sources. So
That's something that I wanted to clarify, and thank you for doing that. But about your magical journey, I mean, so many things have struck me. First of all, you didn't start this yesterday, you started in 2009. And one thing led to the other. You get into the Enochian system. And what really, I think, sets you apart from many people is that when you do something, you fully focus on that tradition, which I think a lot of people lack nowadays. You see this in the magical scene, that people just want to try different things. But in your case, what you do is that when you decide to explore a system, you really take a full, deep immersion into that system. And I think that's what led you to exploring the Heptameron, because you explored the full depth of the Enochian system, and you discovered also that it was different systems for different purposes. Not that the Enochian was inefficient, right?
yeah, well, I definitely didn't explore the full depths of the Enochian system, that's for sure. In fact, I'd say it was kind of superficial, because I started working with the planetary angels versus the depth of the angels that, are locked inside the Enochian system. But a celestial stopper was put on it, and I acknowledged that. I definitely did stop the Enochian system. I gifted all of my stuff to a friend, and I was done with that. I acknowledged there was some authority to that message that came through. So I was off to find what was next. So yeah, I did transition out of Enochian, gifted the stuff, and went into the Key of Solomon. But yeah, I realized when I stumbled across, after practicing the Key of Solomon for a few years, I did realize when I finally started getting into the Heptameron that why the message was so important. And I ceased the work with the Key of Solomon and moved into the Heptameron, where I was told to go to, 4 or so years before.
As it usually happens. It happens to me all the time that I get, some messages and we just ignore them for some kind of reason. And it's just looking back, as you said, many years or months later, that we're like, I would have saved time by just listening that first time.
Humans.
So thank you so much for taking the time really to talk to us about your journey. Now, to the second question is about the fact that you're well immersed into the Solomonic tradition. And I think from our conversations, we made a kind of observation that a lot of people are practicing what is considered Renaissance or post-Renaissance magic. Whereas in your case, you research more about the lineage of the Solomonic tradition, right? And pre-Renaissance magic, is that correct?
Yeah, my interest it definitely fades as we get closer to the Renaissance. My interest is absolutely in the pre-Renaissance. You could say the late medieval era. When we cross that threshold into about the 16th century, there's good information there, and I'm not going to ignore it. But that's not where my heart's a bit earlier in history than that.
I see. So Solomonic magic and the Solomonic tradition, I hear a lot of people, they associate it, and even book titles where it says this is the key of the Solomon the king, right? So I see a lot of people associated with King Solomon. Is that a right association in your opinion, having explored the pre-Renaissance pedigree of the Solomonic tradition?
Yes and no. And the reason I say that is because if you look in like Goetia or the Key of Solomon or various grimoires, there's references to this person, Taz Gregus, which basically is like the Greek Thoth or the Greek Thoth. And so this appears to be a figure. And there's this lineage. In fact, SSM breaks into this. By SSM, it's the book of the sum of sacred magic. It's a 15th century, encyclopedia of doing magic, still being translated, but there are some great things in there. And in there, it talks about a lineage of magic from people. And while these people take mythical names, And while there's obviously no certainty, no proof that these are actual people beyond the context of the grimoires, there's a lineage of Thoth Graecus, or the Greek Thoth, who is the student of a wise magician, Solomon. And the student of Thoth is Honorius of Thebes. So we have Thebes, which is Alexandrian. We have Thoth, which is Greek, and Solomon in all of this, which is like a Hebrew. And so we have this big Mediterranean influence, right, that this stuff exists on. But if you take the stance of SSM, which claims that these are actually people, you wind up having a wise magician, Solomon, who would have known or been very knowledgeable in Greek, Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew, and existed somewhere around the 10th century, and definitely was Christian. So these grimoire titles, the Key of Solomon, some of these do say Solomon the King, but oftentimes you'll see Solomon the Magician as well. And so, well, I think whoever this Solomon the Magician was, if he was an actual person, probably took that name for its mythical stature, as would the Greek Thoth. And so, I mean, are these pseudonyms? Do these mean something else? Are these just names taken? Are they all mythical? Are they all, a person? But if you take the context out of some of these early grimoires, these appear to be actual people, which would make sense, because if this Solomon the magician did indeed exist around the 10th century, that kind of lines up with where the Christian Solomonic magic begins. We have the Key of Solomon, the clavis. The earliest reference we have from historical Peter de Abano was 1301. And while we don't have any manuscripts that old, we have literature which drops that name in his work, and he's a credible source. We have SSM, which is 15th century, Liber Geratis, which we seem to have evidence existing probably back in the 12th century. So everything, and those are like the earliest works that we have with, air quotes here, Solomonic magic, with the traits of drawing the circle, summoning spirits or demons or angels, and doing magic with them in a Christian context. And all of this would align with the idea that these were actual people. So it's not an error, in my opinion, that someone in the 1800s looks at the Key of Solomon and attributes it to the biblical hero. But I think there's another side to that as well.
I see what you mean. So there are parallels, but there is also this, as you said, kind of mythical character that was proficient in different magical traditions and adapted them to the Christian context. Would that be accurate?
I mean, if this was the actual person who lived in around the 10th century, he would have been Christian himself. He would have been influenced by the Mediterranean influences. So that would have been Hebrew, Egyptian, Persian, or Arabic, and Greek. He would have been influenced by all these things. And you can see in the earliest forms of magic that we have, which likely is, of Solomonic tradition, is likely Liber Geratis. We see Arabic influences and we see Hebrew influences. We see all of these things. So there is some credibility to it. There's just no hard fact that this is what it was.
I think too that, having hard facts is very difficult on account of the political and geographical situation going on at the time. But in all cases, I think this is something that is very important that people know, that Abrahamic traditions, the more you get in depth, you start realizing these similar influences, the similarities, especially that they have all been kind of, I would say, reshaped during that 10th century period that you're referring to. Mm-hmm. So this all goes in line with the evolution of other older traditions and how they evolved together after this period. So I think this is something that our listeners will really appreciate knowing about. So on to the next question. You started with the OTO. So you started with more modern stuff, and then you moved back into the older traditions. So what would you say are the main differences between post-Renaissance and pre-Renaissance magic?
Okay, so post-Renaissance, I mean, that can run all the way up to like our modern stuff, and we have this, first I'll draw the hard line around psychology.
Okay.
Because when we start diving into psychology, you have Freud, Jung, things like that pop up. Magic, what we have in our modern system, definitely takes hold of a lot of that psychological stuff. It changes a lot of the perspectives and knowledge that we have from our history in magic, but it definitely changes it a lot. And that was the system that I got involved in originally, and still am involved in. There's no lying about that. I'm still an initiate of Wicca, and I'm still an initiate of OTO. But when it comes down to magic, there is a great divide there. So we'll call it that. Now, when you get into like Renaissance, so we're talking like the Book of Oberon, we're talking about many of the keys. A lot of people don't realize. I don't think there's a key that's been translated that dates before the 18th century. They're out there in their original Latin. They're all really modern. And I mean, by the fact that we have the first mention of the clavis in 1301, but like the oldest English translated key of Solomon is like 1790 something. A lot can happen, in 500 years. We see names and corruptions happen within 60 years, let alone 500. You find some very big differences when you start diving into the older clavises that we have. But, they're not English. So you have to really, if you don't speak Latin, you have to do your homework. But that information is out there. And I will tell you, Joseph Peterson's Esoteric Archives and his footnotes are just gold. Things that guy does is just massive. So, give credit where credit's due. So if you don't speak Latin and you want to know more about this, go read what he has on his website. Go and read the footnotes, because he's going to give you lots of translations from earlier sources. But so we get into the Renaissance. We have the biggest difference is probably uniformity. And you could probably credit Agrippa for this. The 3 books of occult philosophy and the 4th book, we're sort of talking Pseudo-Agrippa. Those essentially were published in 1531. So they were a snapshot of what practice was like around that era, which includes prior to. But what happened is they became so infamous that they became standards. And so in Renaissance magic, you're going to find very little that contradicts the information presented in Agrippa's work. Now, if we go before Agrippa, we have a lot more variation from practice to practice. Where post-Agrippa, you could start to reconcile things like, well, take the Heptameron, for example. You can reconcile nearly all of the Heptameron and make it work with, say, the Key of Solomon. I mean, a good chunk of the Heptameron structure is the Key of Solomon. But if you rewind to the predecessor and what we know of, say, the Lucidarium Necromantiae, which predates Agrippa's work, we see things that cannot be reconciled. So when we go before Agrippa as a milestone in history here, so if we go pre-Agrippa, we have a lot more variation in practice. And when we get to the Renaissance, we have a lot more standardization. And I kind of like the nitty-gritty variations when we get to the earlier late medieval stuff.
That's very interesting. So I think what you're saying basically is that after Agrippa, there was uniformity within Christian magic as a whole, would you say?
Yeah, I would say that. Loosely, I would say that, because you dive into like the Protestant Reformation and stuff shortly after and whatnot, and things get messy and lots of rewrites happen. But in general, yeah, I think that's safe to say.
That's important, something that you mentioned about the 3 books of occult philosophy as being an encyclopedia, because I see a parallel to Albuni's Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra, which is divided into 3 sections, and that's 3 different books. And it is kind of an encyclopedia. And it also did the same thing within the Arabic tradition, that I uniformized a lot of the practices, because as he said himself, he collected it from all over the place in his travels, and he put it into a book to the service of the readers. So I see a parallel there between Agrippa and what Albuni did in the Arabic tradition. My next question goes in line to that, about the main influences that shaped the Solomonic tradition. So you're talking about the Hellenistic influences, the Judaic influences, the Arabic influences. Are there any other influences, or are those the main ones that made it into what it is today?
Well, the root is definitely Christian. And with that, you're going to have kind of Byzantine influence with Greek stuff. And you're going to find probably those will be the two dominant influences. And when we get into more minor influences, we're going to see more of the Arabic and Hebrew stuff. But the Hebrew stuff, it ties into like the Merkava and a lot of like dream visions and things like that, which is not predominantly found in later. I mean, it's there, but it's not predominantly found in like the Renaissance Solomonic magic. So yeah, the big ones would be the Greek and the Christian Greek, and then Hebrew and Arabic. And it's just, you think this was floating around the Mediterranean area. So you're going to have, I mean, all in all, there's a lot of influences up there.
Definitely. But I think you said, one of the most important is Byzantine, and we know about Constantinople, how it was going back and forth between Muslims and Christians and being captured. So I think there was kind of a melting pot going there, and that's when it all happened.
Yep, for sure.
So when you say Arabic is a minor influence, what similarity do you see in there?
Okay, so a line should kind of be drawn here, because when we say Solomonic magic, a lot of people just group that together as one type of magic. But there are what I would call lineages if you look closer. And it's not just like the Taz line of the clavis or the Rabbi Solomon line of the clavis. I mean, like the Key of Solomon clearly originated somewhere other than where the Heptameron originated, and we can see that because there's contradictions that don't work together, but there's still Solomonic magic. So when you say the Arabic influences, it's kind of a loaded question, because if we're talking about like the Key of Solomon, we do have some remnants of image magic inside the Key of Solomon. And well, at the time, pre-Renaissance, there were not a bunch of pentacles. There were only 9 Kandari. And they were made to some degree with astrological consideration, not a whole lot, day and hour of Mercury and the moon waxing. And I believe that, I'm going to emphasize that here, that it tied also with the moon shouldn't be conjunct with the sun. And there may have been references to Saturn and Mars being in good angles, or not in bad angles anyway, with the moon. But nonetheless, there were only those 9 pentacles. And when you get into kind of that image magic, there does seem to pull some of the Arabic influence, like you see in the Picatrix, which is obviously really heavy on image magic. Even in the Byzantine work, which influenced the Key of Solomon, there is still some astrological consideration, though not what I think people put on today. When you get into the Renaissance side of things melted even more into each other, and astrological consideration became way more important in, say, the 18th century than it was in Solomonic magic in the 15th century. When you get into the other line, like the Heptameron lineage, which I would say, which is very different from the Key of Solomon, astrology plays a minimal role there. In fact, it could be more summed up in astronomy, because the only real consideration is the sign on the horizon. And there's not image magic in the sense of crafting a pentacle and having that pentacle radiate some type of magical property. You do have pentacles, but they only contain the image of the archangel as a symbol of the archangel. And you use those during the time of invoking archangels. So they're not the same. So what's the influence, or the minor influence, or similarities between Arabic magic and Solomonic magic? And there's a ton. And it's not the same from one line of Solomonic magic to the other line of Solomonic magic. So if you're talking like the Heptameron or the Elucidarium, that predates the Heptameron. I mean, in the end, the Heptameron is an Elucidarium. I guess we'll just put it that way. But the earlier stuff. And into its predecessors, like Liber Geratis, some of those similarities would be the spirits, which I know we'll touch on later. So I'm not going to crack that egg right now. There's calling multitudes of spirits, which is another thing, like a lot. There's the emphasis of the day and the spirits of the day, the emphasis of the hour over the day, and overall this kind of forgotten tradition of the hierarchy of the moment in time of which you do the working. All of those, from my understanding, are seen in kind of the Arabic forms there as well. And by that, and perhaps I should elaborate there, by the emphasis of the celestial hierarchy of the moment of doing the work, there is this tradition. You see it there's remnants of it in Sefer Razialis, Sefer Hemalach, that there are angels and celestial spirits which rule over the hour and the day and the seasons and the sun and the moon and the earth, all within that season, and then kind of get shaped into elementals in more modern time of the earth and the water and the air and such, all under the seasons as well. And so the emphasis is more along the lines of calling the right spirits at the right time, rather than aligning yourself to, working on, say, the day and hour of Mercury. What's more important is you get the hierarchy right. So those are all kind of Arabic, from my understanding, those are all kind of Arabic influences. Maybe not influences, but they're definitely shared between the two methods.
I agree. On the Arabic side of things, Al-Buni, what he does is he basically classifies the days and classifies the hours. This hour is good for this hour is good for that. From your answering, what you're saying basically is that when we get into the astrological considerations, people are kind of aligning themselves to the planetary rays and how they interact with each other to influence on the magical working, making of a talisman, something like that. But in the case of the Heptameron and the similarities that you're seeing is that it's more of a schedule, really. Is like which spirit is working at that time. So you make sure that you're calling who's working at that time, and then you'll be successful no matter what time you're working. And I think this is a more practical side of things, one could say, because if someone is a true magician who works every day, it only makes sense that they have a system to be able to work every single day and not to wait for some astrological alignment that would happen every 30 years. Or am I mistaken?
Yeah, no, you're right. There's more to this. So whether you're waiting 30 years to make some Jupiter talisman, for example, or whether you're doing something like daily, or if you're a working magician, it doesn't make sense to have to wait 30 years to make a Jupiter talisman and things like that. So yeah, you're 100% right. And when it comes to especially considerations like the planetary alignment, even then you have the idea of like the deacons kind of transmutating into the hours of the day through the week. So even then there is some astrological consideration, even though it's fairly lost at that point. And even then, as far as I'm aware, that's more of an educated guess that the hours derive from those deacons. But there's, again, differences in the kind or the lineage of Solomonic magic you work. You were mentioning that the hours, there's favorable hours versus unfavorable hours. And you see that pretty verbatim in the Byzantine stuff, the hygromantia and such. This hour is good for this, and this hour is good for that. And this hour is not good at all. You shouldn't do anything on this hour, that sort of stuff. But that stuff's largely missing in other lines, like Libra Geratis, for example. Libra Geratis, you work on the 11th hour, and that's it. That's when you start your work. And this is after like a 20-day purification, which is after a 3-day purification to get divine permission to even pursue. So, I mean, so
commit, that's all I have to say.
It's a long journey there, but there's no day consideration, just the hour. And There's notes that if you fail at your conjuration, to try the next day, which speaks to kind of the disregard of the day. But if you get into like the Byzantine stuff, you do have the favorable hours on each day. You see it in the Book of Wisdom as well, which is Apollonius of Tyana's Book of Wisdom, big influence there. But that system of that specific hierarchy where it's less about the magical timing and more about simply calling on the right spirits during the time, that's present there as well. But the day and hour that we're so familiar with in Solomonic magic, like the Key of Solomon, that stuff existed back then as well. So at the same time that Liber Iuratus was being practiced, which disregards the day and magical timing of the day and hour kind of alignment, you also had people practicing the Key of Solomon, which has its roots in the Byzantine stuff, which was using the day and hour. If you wanted to work with mercurial spirits, you waited for the day and hour of Mercury on a waxing moon, versus Liber Iuratus, if you want to work with, well, it didn't really matter because you conjured all the spirits anyway. So it didn't matter if it's Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, you call all the spirits from all of the hierarchies, celestial hierarchies at the same time anyway.
You can't really call the wrong one if you're calling everybody.
Yeah, there's priority, but in the end, you call them all and they all come. So
The more
it's a little
the merrier.
different. Yeah, in the end with Iuratus, you're calling, if you look at the spirits, you're calling the winds, which deliver the kings. You're calling all the winds for all 7 kings. You're calling all 7 kings, and then you're calling all the ministers. So by the time you drop all those names, you're well over 100 spirits that you have.
That's something that a lot of practitioners would bask at. A lot of people say, don't call more than one spirit or this spirit or that spirit. But where you as a working magician, there's no problem calling 100 spirits for a single ritual. And this goes hand in hand, usually with results, if I'm not mistaken.
There's definitely some differences. Even the Heptameron, if you look at the Heptameron, it's largely reduced in its spirit work. 95% of the instruction in the Heptameron for working with spirits comes from Liber Iuratus. There's stuff that comes from the Key and Razialis and CLM 849 as well. But when it comes to actually working with the spirits and what you say and what you do, it comes from Liber Iuratus. But it is so greatly reduced that you only work with one king, for example, instead of all of them. And you work with their ministers, or maybe even just a minister in lieu of the king. But it's greatly reduced,
This actually goes on to my next question, because you say Iuratus, there are no astrological considerations there. So for some people that claim that astrology is missing from the grimoires because it was just taken for granted that the magicians knew astrology and that they just knew when to work it. Is that true?
So we have to acknowledge first that most grimoires are working notes, basically. And I say most because then there's works like Liber Iuratus, which are massive, and SSM, which is even more massive. And those are not just notes. Those are full books of a complete system of magic. So yes, while it's true that many grimoires out there are simply notes, a great example is the Ghent manuscript. There's an elucidarium inside the Ghent manuscript. And when you look at where it was writing from, while it represents one of the earliest elucidariums that we see, it doesn't have all the planetary conjurations. It has like 3 of them. Just to give you an example of what they are, and it leaves off the others because you can basically reconstruct the others based off of the few notes that are in there. So while we first acknowledge that many grimoires are just notes of a working magician, I think it is a grave oversimplification and misunderstanding to say that astrology was simply known by these people. And the reason that I say that is because we have examples. We have like the Hygromantia. The Hygromantia definitely teaches, like the point of that book is to teach a system of magic. It explains, it talks about things like, what does this sign mean when the moon is in this sign? What does it mean when we have Saturn in a bad alignment with the moon? Certain things to avoid like that. And so we have something as fundamental, in the grand scheme of things of what astrology is. It's really fundamental to know what the moon represents in certain signs. And if it's going to teach certain things that are so fundamental, if it takes the time to write chapters about fundamental things, it would have taken the time to write chapters about more important and significant parts of astrology. It would have taken time to explain trines and conjuncts with certain planets and things to avoid and things that are favorable, but it doesn't, because it wasn't important to the system. You have a work that teaches, and it teaches the things that you need to know. Like, it's not just a note. This is literally teaching. And those things are missing, not because it was assumed to know, because if it was assumed to know, you would know what the sign means, what it means when the moon is in the sign. They were excluded because they're not pertinent. And you can see in the Key of Solomon, right? The big thing with the Key of Solomon is all of these astrological considerations for making the pentacles. You have the fifth pentacle of the sun and the seventh pentacle or the sixth pentacle of Jupiter and all of these. And people will wait until the sun is in the sign. People will avoid Mars being square with the moon, or they'll want Jupiter in a favorable aspect with the moon and things like that. And while that stuff is documented, albeit in much more recent post-Renaissance works, that stuff is absent in early keys as well. When you look at the Key of Solomon, it's even preserved in the more recent manuscripts that you make things on the day and hour, that the pentacles are made on the day and hour. And that's an instruction from the original 9 Kandari. But the 9 Kandari went MIA in probably the 16th century, 16th century. We have grimoires of the clavis, which don't have pentacles at all. So sometime prior to that, there were only 9 pentacles up until about the 15th, 16th century. And then there were no pentacles. And then around the 17th century, we get 42 pentacles all of a sudden. And they're not categorized by planets. They're not to be made on certain metals because they weren't planetary. And they don't get reclassified as planetary until the 18th century, late 18th century at that. So, this idea of all of these pentacles being Solomonic magic and stuff, it's while it's documented in the Key of Solomon, those things were not there in the inception, or even in its midlife, you could say. 500 years later, we start seeing all of these things. And so there were no planetary considerations because they weren't planetary pentacles. So yeah, the emphasis of planetary consideration in Solomonic magic is largely overstated and overemphasized. And while it is true and documented in more modern manuscripts and texts of Solomonic magic, 18th century, for example, those things aren't there early on. The only place we really see them is in the small bits, which are related to image magic.
So something that you said that really struck me is the difference between working notes and manuals. And you're absolutely right, and this only comes when you've read so many grimoires that you know the difference between someone who just decided to publish a collection of their working history, or someone who decided that he was going to teach a system of magic from A to Z. So in the case of Liber Iuratus, as you mentioned, is that it is a full-on manual. In a manual that will teach you how to have success, going from zero to hero in a certain magical system, it would definitely not forget to mention something as important that would decide your success, as some people claim, which is astrological consideration. Because some people think that, this is the difference between success and failure, literally. So I think this doesn't make any sense, because these people have been working magic, teaching magic, getting results with no consideration to astrology. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Even in the case of, the planetary hierarchy that we talk about, there's definitely different cultures out there involved with this kind of magic. You have certain cultures which put a large emphasis on celestial arrangements, that when the heavens align in a certain way, that it brings a certain benediction or malice to the time. And if you can preserve an image that was made under that alignment, that image would radiate that emphasis of the time of its creation. And there's a lot of cultures that put emphasis on that because that, I mean, next to God, that is one of the primary things that dictate what our world is like. But on the Christian side of things, when I say Christian side, I'm talking early Solomonic magic, there's much less of that because the emphasis is on the spirits, not the stars. The spirits are the ones that cause the change. And because of that, there's very little emphasis on the stars at all. And in these early works, there's even very little emphasis on spirits being planetary at all. In fact, there's plenty of points where it specifies that a lot of terrestrial spirits are not necessarily planetary, that they are way too chaotic to even categorize. And so we throw them under a planetary hierarchy to contain them and control them. So there's direct examples that the terrestrial spirits aren't planetary at all, but we organize them in a manner that can bring order, which is a part of the emphasis of the grand scheme of the celestial hierarchy of the time to help control them.
That is very, very interesting. I mean, as human beings, we do have a need to categorize everything and put a label over everything. So why should we stop at spirits, right? We will definitely label spirits under this planet or that planet, depending on our perception, which actually bridges on to my next question, because, you know, you said about the categorization and systemizing everything. So some people believe that magic can only be worked, you know, and literally only during the proper day and at the proper hour. So we've established that's not true, but what are in your research and in your experiences, the arguments against that?
So I wouldn't say it's a pro, like a for and against type of argument, because there are traditions that date way back to working magic on the proper day and hour. And I wouldn't refute that that's a thing and a part of that tradition. But I would specify here, or clarify maybe, that it is a tradition. And there is another tradition where that stuff is largely disregarded, where, for example, the Key of Solomon, as we've stated before, is heavy on the day and hour, predominantly in making pentacles, the 9 Kandari, in making the tools. It's all day and hour of Mercury, day and hour of Mercury. You know, the moon is waxing day and hour of Mercury. And so you had to wait until that time to do that work. But that stuff is largely not existent in the other lineage like Liber Iuratis, or the Elucidarium, where you have the emphasis on the celestial timing. Like, okay, you can do your working literally whenever. You just need to call the right spirits. You want to work with a spirit that's considered martial. Well, you can do it on a Thursday whenever you want. At any hour, so long as you call the right spirits to control and contain that spirit, that hierarchy, if controlling and containing is necessary, which isn't always the case. But the emphasis is largely disregarding the day and hour and moving right into the spirit. Now, in some cases, spirits rule days, in which case, if you want to target a spirit that rules on a Thursday, you should probably do it on the day that it's ruling. But we also see that that's not necessarily the case, because in Liber Iuratis, you call all of them whenever. So if you're working on a Wednesday, you're still calling martial spirits and solar spirits and Venusian spirits, you know. And so despite the fact that they rule a day, doesn't mean that they're not available during other times, you know. So the emphasis is very much on the celestial hierarchy of the moment in one tradition, which is valid. And in another tradition, the hierarchy is specific to the planetary day and hour, which also is valid. But these are two different traditions that are both lumped into Solomonic magic. And even then you get kind of this mix, like some of the Byzantine stuff, which is like, well, the day and hour may not be so necessary, but, you know, there are good and bad hours of the day. So perhaps the day and hour of Thursday on the second hour of Jupiter might be a bad hour to do a working, which, you know, would contradict the day and hour of the key. But, you know, that tradition also has some deeper roots with the celestial spirits of the time. So, I mean, there are multiple traditions inside Solomonic magic. And when it comes to timing, all valid, but not all of them reconcile with each other.
Interesting. So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that there is a case for both. Yes, there is a case for a tradition that works at certain times of the day and certain days. And there's also a case for a tradition which completely disregards that, as long as you follow the proper hierarchy at the time of your working. Is that correct?
Okay, so it's time to voice something here. If you're going off of grimoires, that is correct. If you're practicing the Key of Solomon, you should do it that way. If you're practicing the Lucidarium or, the modern Heptameron, you should do it that way. If you're doing the Book of Wisdom or the Hygromantia, you should do it that way. But there is some account of actual practicing magicians. This is all just the baseline, right? The grimoires are a baseline. Many of the big ones, the popular ones, are instructional. They're not just random notes. They're how you do a system, and it's a baseline. And that doesn't mean that you have to do it that way all the time. But if you're going to start somewhere, you should start at that baseline. I am not of the mind that you always have to do it by the book. In my experience, when you begin developing relationships with spirits and doing magic, evolution happens and you learn things. I have not once been put in a place where the things that I have learned have contradicted the baseline. They have simply elaborated that baseline. And I think that definitely I'm one of the more cautious in this kind of opinion, that you have to be careful of contradiction, because when contradiction arises, there's a bigger conflict happening. But in my system, in my personal working, certain modifications or instructions that have been given to me, they don't contradict, but they elaborate or expand. And that stuff is important. So just putting it out there that, yes, if you're working a grimoire by the book, you should follow that tradition. But that's not to say that we'll take a more modern work like the Goetia and the spirits within the Goetia. If I wanted to conjure one of those using a system like Liber Geratis, which is amendable to doing such a thing by the book, by the way, you can do it, even though you can only conjure, say, I don't recall exactly, but you can only conjure certain spirits during certain hours of the day. Kings from sunrise to noon, or, I don't know if that's right, but that sort of span. But I know that you can conjure dukes at different times than specified in the grimoire of the Goetia, using a system like the Heptameron. So I know that it's possible to do those things, but you shouldn't just go and do those things. You need to measure yourself against those baselines. There's bigger things at play here. And when you take on shortcuts or you start getting reckless, things become chaotic real quick, and you cheat yourself out of certain experiences. So my stance is, if you're working a grimoire, work it by the book and establish those baselines, learn the rules, and evolution will come. But I'm not going to go out there and advocate that people just start implementing shortcuts and experimenting. Like, you got to earn that part,
Definitely. I cannot agree with you more than that. And it is something that has been said by very wise men before, is that you have to know all the rules before you know which rules you can break. I think that's what you're saying. And that if you're deciding to explore a tradition, whatever it is, you should, first of all, try and do it by the book until you can elaborate, as you said, and you have new developments, new information come into light, especially from the spirits from that system, as you gain more knowledge of it, to actually take your practice further. Now, I'm glad that you talk about your experience, because my next question was about that. In your experience as a working magician, what are the necessary astrological considerations for a successful ritual? That, from what you know right now, that, okay, whatever I work, I make sure that this and this and this is happening in the astral world.
So prefacing this with unverified personal gnosis, right? This is how things work for me and things that I have noticed. This is not me advocating that you guys or whoever's listening try it this way, step by step and experimentation. And the rules that apply from spirits to people or spirits to magicians in one example may be radically different to those in others. So that said, I have had success on waning moons. Our predominant thing that you try to avoid when working, that it should be waxing. The results are very different for me, almost like a night shift versus the day shift. you come to to a warehouse to pick up something from the day shift, you get treated very different than showing up in the night shift, where they're like, yeah, we're not, you got the wrong guys, you need to come back later. So I don't do it often, but there's definitely something happening in the waning moon. So I do try to observe the waxing moon. There are some circumstances that I have experience with that I would go to a waning moon for, but very few and far between. The sign on the horizon is important when working with celestial stuff, in my opinion. So a lot of the more modern grimoires, especially the Pentacles, when they talk about it, a lot of them will use kind of a generic language to say the sign should be Capricorn, or make this in Capricorn, or make this in Gemini. And people will take kind of a modern approach to that and say, okay, well, the sun needs to be in Gemini to do this, or the sun should be in Capricorn to do this. But there's lots of examples in the late medieval era where books on astrology reference certain timings, and the generic references imply that the sign is actually on the horizon. So to say you do this under Gemini is not to say that you do this when the sun is in Gemini. You do this when Gemini is on the horizon. So I find that really doesn't matter with terrestrial stuff, but it certainly seems to matter with celestial stuff. And you'll notice my lingo here when I say celestial and terrestrial. I'm intentionally trying to avoid the terms angels and demons, but that's really what I'm referencing here. Terrestrial would be what most people might consider demons. In the Christian context, you could identify those as evil or whatever, but that's a grave oversimplification and all out wrong in most instances. And angels, people think, like good and the glorified and the heavenly, and there's some grave oversimplifications there as well. So I try to avoid those terms. But when I'm talking about celestial, I'm talking about angels, which usually have a celestial type of association to them.
This is fascinating for me, Adley. You're talking about your own experience, but I see a lot of similarities between what you're saying from your own personal experience and my tradition. For example, working on the waning moons. In the Arabic tradition, we focus on the moon mansion. So we can work basically on the waxing and the waning moon. It's not as important for it to be waxing or waning as important for it to be in the right mansion for the work that you're going to do.
Sure. Yeah.
Because in your case as a practicing magician, sometimes you can't really wait 15 days for it to start, waxing again. And there is emphasis though on that, I think, where there are sometimes emergencies and you really can't wait. But those, in my opinion, those do become jeopardized, at least in my experiences, that, well, it is a big variable to introduce, one that I think all bets are off for results, in my opinion. And if, for example, a client came to me and said, oh, I need this done in 4 days, and doesn't give me the 9-day purification process, the time to do that. It doesn't give me, the waxing moon. If this is really that important, it should really wait. But obviously, if they feel like it needs to get done, all bets are off, but we can certainly give it a try. If anything, it's all an experiment. But yeah, I would really emphasize that I would wait in nearly all cases till that moon is waxing. Because my goal is success. And well, certain spirits definitely are active on that waning moon. The goal is success, not that spirits are around. So yeah, well, it certainly can be done, at least in my experiences. It really, really should wait, if at all possible. I agree. One should always aim for the most favorable odds and have everything coming into favor of our magic. But sometimes, as you said, if there's an emergency, and I think this is, when you realize that the more you do and you build this relationship with the spirits, that the less you have to do. Because as you mentioned,
yes,
you didn't have sometimes the 9-day purification, you didn't have the waxing moon, and you perform the ritual because you want to help the person, and it is an emergency situation, and lo and behold, it works. So that's amazing. And that speaks to your experience and the relationship that you have with those spirits, which actually bridges on to my next question. Some magicians preach a strictly friendly and harmonious approach to dealing with the spirits. Others advise pure caution and animosity. Like you're going to control the spirit and kind of threaten it all the time to burn it, so on and so forth. So you see this in different, I would say modern versus traditional grimoires. What is the case for both? And in your experience as a practicing magician, and this is what I really want to highlight here, is that this is not a person who has book knowledge or has read all the grimoires. This is a person who is in contact and in constant dealing with these spirits. What do you think is the most advisable approach to dealing with these spiritual kings, in their own right?
It's a good question, and there's a lot of controversy to it. And I think a lot of the apprehension towards kind of that firm approach towards spirits is misassociation and misidentifying the process that we see in the different lineages. Like I mentioned, we have in the Lucidarium where the emphasis is on the celestial hierarchy of the moment. That's important to make sure that if you're working on the hour of Jupiter, on the day of Mercury in winter, that you get all the spirits of that hierarchy down, because the spirits are to answer to those celestial forces. And in that system, it is very hierarchy based. The spirit answers to its hierarchy, which answers to its superior, and its superior all the way up into the celestial world, which answers to its superior, blah, 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 like an army, right? And in that manner, it's all higher power down. And versus something like, say, in the Key of Solomon, or something where you deal with just one spirit or very few spirits, where kind of the emphasis of that hierarchical structure is not as predominant. I think some of the animosity towards this like firm hand towards spirits comes from not realizing the difference in the method of conjuring spirits. If you look at the Heptameron as a great example that's been translated into English, so it's available to look at. If you look at the process of conjuration, there's multiple steps to the conjuration. And if you read it like a book, you basically ask them to come. And if they don't come, you ask them again in a little bit more of a formal way. And if they still don't do what you want them to do, then you start getting more heavy-handed with it. Ultimately to the end where you're basically like debasing them of their authority and blah, 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 blah. It gets really nasty. And you force them by the seal of God. They do what you want them to do. And, people will read this like this is the conjuration. And this is not the conjuration. This is different steps of conjuring. I always use an analogy here of the relationship of medieval England, Spain, and France, which were at each other's throats all the time. And to defend itself against France, a delegation happened, or an agreement happened, where Spain and England decided that they would set aside their differences so that they could deal with France. Now, these two were enemies, Spain and England. They were enemies throughout this whole thing. They were not all of a sudden best friends and teaming up against France. If England showed weakness, Spain, and it happened, Spain would have England's ass and vice versa. But it's important that they communicate in a way that achieves a desired end. So if you take, for example, this example and instead say, okay, you have these different kingdoms that we're from. We have these human mankind, one group, and then you have this other kingdom of spirits. They're not best friends. And well, friendship can happen, and well, spirits and people can work together efficiently, like Spain and England worked together efficiently at times. That's the process. You imagine you are a delegate and they're a delegate. You don't get anywhere by going to, say, Spain comes over. You don't get anywhere by strong arming Spain. They send a delegate over to England. You wine and dine. You tell your stories and you have a good time. And then when it's time to get down to business, you know what? We've enjoyed each other's company. Let's get down to business. But if it got to a point where Spain would not cooperate with England, you bet that the conversation got heavy and that consequences were threatened, but it doesn't go there unless it has to go there. So you look at these conjurations And the first few conjurations are polite and they are formal. You give them an offering of incense, which draws the spirit in and of itself. It's something that they like. And so you're trying to lure them politely. You read that first conjuration, there's nothing gross or nasty there. It's a polite conjuration. Even the second conjuration is polite. It's just more formally worded. But yeah, if the spirits don't show up, then you continue. But you don't, it's not a single conjuration. If they show up in the polite, nice part, you don't go on and start cursing them, you know. You stop and you skip the rest and you start to welcome them into the circle, you know. But this controversy between you should be friends with the spirits or you should be stern with the spirits, the answer is both. It's not best friends time when you do magic. It's let's work together and complete this together time. And if that can be done on friendly terms, that will 110% be the best way to do it. But you have to be prepared, in my experience, to take it to the next level if necessary. So I look at it like delegations. You guys can work together and you guys can go and you get drinks together and you can tell your stories together. You can hang out and have a good time. But when business needs done and business isn't getting done, you need to start showing your badge of authority and working that way. So I am an advocate of being a good delegate, working in the manner that a delegate should work, not necessarily one of be kind or be rude, you know?
That is a great analogy that you use about being a delegate, because when we think of a delegate as someone who is diplomatic, he's not going to come looking for support arrogantly, and he's not going to bow down to the person they're looking for support from. He's going to use most typically a balanced approach, which I think what you're saying right now is that you start out nice, but if push comes to shove, you have to threaten. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, in my experiences, once an established relationship happens, it very rarely ever escalates beyond the being firm stage. You know, I find that the only real time or the only real common time that you have to get nasty with spirits using this other method, this traditional method of all of these hierarchical celestial powers, the only time that you really have to get nasty is the initial couple times that you conjure. And the most I can rationalize of this is a spirit's just like, who is this dude? Like, why should I come to this guy? Like, I don't know this guy. What is he? Who does he think he is? You know? But after the process, and, you know, the license to depart is its own kind of binding of, you know, come peaceably when I call you next, you know, blah, blah, blah. Things get a lot easier. But that goes to speak towards, you know, the general evolution of magic as you continue to practice. But yeah, you should definitely be friendly if you can be friendly, but you need to hold on to your authority. You have an authority. And if you need to pull out your authority card, then you need to be prepared to do that.
That's very interesting and very good advice for our listeners, which I think are going to appreciate the fact that they do have an authority, that there is a case for authority, but it is not the first card that you draw. So there is always wisdom and balance, I say, which brings me to my next question is planetary influences, because we know that the spirits of the Heptameron and even the angels ruling them are associated and divided by planets. We've talked about Raphael having some associations, Michael having some different associations. Is it a case of the chicken and the egg? And what I mean by that is, are those spirits planetary in nature, or did we make them? Did we label them by those planets? From your research and experience, of course, I'm not looking for a definite answer. I think nobody has a definite answer, but from your experience, knowledge, and research, do you think we associate them to the planets, or they really have some associations of their own?
Sure. It's a good question. In my experience, there is some, or in my research rather, there is some degree of fluctuation to this. You know, if you look at the order of angels from periods to periods, you see that sometimes they change with emphasis. The hierarchy, like the Catholic Church has this whole hierarchy of angels and cherubim and so on and so forth. And during different councils, those change slightly. which is reflective of kind of mankind's organizational habit. We like things in a certain order. There's definitely evidence when it comes down to terrestrial spirits that they really are not planetary, that we kind of align them to planetary correspondences because we have learned to get better results from them in that manner. It's like Dr. Al Cummins in one of our talks, he used this analogy, and I'll see if I can get this right. He said, people will oftentimes say a scorpion stings because it's martial. When the truth of the matter is that we consider a scorpion martial because it stings. That we tend to organize things in a manner that makes sense for us. In this way, I think a lot of the terrestrial spirits are not necessarily in a harmonious organization that, say, martial spirits, or what we consider martial terrestrial spirits, are harmonious with martial celestial spirits or their martial hierarchy, but rather that they are agitated by them and disturbed by them. In a lot of these old grimoires, disturbance is a way of raising power. Like ants, you put red and black ants in a jar, they're not going to start killing each other until you shake that jar. And so there's definitely evidence to say that at the time of, 12th century or so, that it was believed that terrestrial spirits didn't really belong to a celestial hierarchy, but we organized them that way because it got us controlled results. You can go further into this, where Liber Iuratus just flat out states that, there are offices of certain angels. So these Saturnine angels have a certain office, but then it goes on to say that the spirits under them share that office. But this office can change at any time. There's evidence there of a perspective that, these spirits, both celestial and terrestrial, are, say, under the influence of Saturn or organized in a Saturn hierarchy, and that they hold a rather Saturn-esque office of duty, that it changes based on God's will, essentially. And that the terrestrial spirits that are organized under the celestial spirits only have the office that's delegated to them by the celestial hierarchy. So there is some degree of fluctuation in these early grimoires as well. So do we do the argument of, is it chicken and the egg? Was it planetary first and the angels were attributed to the planet? Or were the angels their own thing and we just organized them? There's a little bit of evidence that we organize them in this state. But as the grimoires go on, as we enter the Renaissance and standards become standards, things solidified into a very hierarchically organized pattern. But pre-Agrippa, pre those encyclopedic standards, there was a lot of flexibility here. And this is one of those things that I admire in that late medieval era before all the standards. There are subtleties that exist that just kind of get wiped out.
Definitely. And I think this is the case for exploring, for people such as yourself who are actually immersing themselves in that period, and the benefits of it, that it brings a richness to an already very rich tradition, which is Renaissance and post-Renaissance magic, but just brings these subtle nuances that not everything is set in stone. And a lot of people out there believe that Raphael is responsible for the sun and he's the only one, but it turns out it's not really the case. So and we're not looking to say that people are wrong. We're just trying to add another perspective, a subtle nuance, just as these old grimoires do for the people who research them. And this ties into my next question, because you mentioned something about offices changing by God's will, and also that the terrestrial spirits have the same offices as the celestial spirits. This is very important because we kind of agreed that the Elucidarium and Liber Juratus were actually using a combination, from what I understood from what you're saying, a combination of celestial and terrestrial spirit. And
Mhm.
this ties into something that you said before, that some people say that they're all evil, right? They're all very malicious, and other people say they're, neutral. So from your experience, again, because everybody can go read the grimoires, and I'm really interested to bring out and highlight your experience. What are their offices and what place do they hold in the hierarchy? Because from what I understand is that they only respond to the angels above them.
So the offices, Liber Juratus is a great example because it goes in depth about their offices. And there's certain references there that are important too. Like, for example, the fact that their office can change. So here we are talking about, the office of the Mars celestial and terrestrial spirits, and then realizing that, they'll do other things too. Just this is the gist of it. The fact that it speaks to terrestrial spirits being chaotic and that they can do all sorts of kinds of things. But we get good results by pairing them under these, angels and such. So the offices will vary, and they're fairly consistent with what you would think of, like you think of Jupiter with fortune and luck. But, there's a lot of crossover too, that the spirits of Jupiter, the spirits of Mercury, and the spirits of Mars, in fact, I think 4 of the 7 state explicitly that they control health and the wellness or unwellness of individuals. And there's a lot of cases where these descriptions of offices overlap with multiple other offices. And that's kind of a clue there too, of the fluidity of both the terrestrial and celestial office. And I think there's a clue there too, when you work with Liber Juratus and you call all of them at once. And I think that's because they work more as a single unit, as the SSM puts it, as a single council, as opposed to individually. They work together. So yes, there is definitely fluidity in their office. They're not classified as evil and good. I mean, the words will pop up of evil and good, but the references that they're talking about is safety, the ability to cause harm. So they will say there's 3 classes of spirits. There's good spirits and evil spirits and not good or evil spirits. And so you have the sun and the moon classified as good spirits. But as you read on, you realize that they're good spirits because it's not in their nature to cause harm. And if you look at the bad spirits or the evil spirits, you have Saturn and Mars, and they're evil spirits because it is in their nature to cause harm. And then you have the not good or evil spirits, which is Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter. And they are not good or evil because it's not really in their nature to necessarily favor harm or favor peace or not harm. And so it's really not a standard of good and evil spirits. It's a standard of safety. Which ones are safe to work with and which ones do you need to be really cautious working with? So yeah, I would dispel, at least in the case of the catalog of spirits within Liber Juratus and the Heptameron and the Lucidarium, because they're all the same. I would dispel the idea that these are evil and good spirits. It's a matter of harm and danger, not good and evil. We also have references where it speaks to the kings, and it says that these spirits are looked at and cast down by the church as enemies and as harmful and dangerous and against God. But then it goes on to explain that the evidence of working with them has proved this to be wrong and an incorrect statement. So there's testimony within the text saying that while the church looks down on these spirits, the matter of the fact is that they do things that are worthy of redemption, I think is how it puts it. So it's speaking in and of itself that these are not just a good and evil sort of thing. And while the church may look at these spirits and say these are evil spirits and not to be worked with, the practitioner is refuting that, saying, well, regardless what the church says, these spirits have redeeming qualities. So there's a bunch of info for you.
Yeah, and also when you look at Christian grimoires like the Elucidarium and Liber Juratus, the conjurations are really pious, in my opinion. So I can definitely see priests doing these conjurations, and as you said, do something with the spirit that is worthy of redemption. So
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because this lineage of the Heptameron to the Elucidarium to Liber Iuratus has a very important role of the priest, and they involve the priest. Liber Iuratus is explicitly that a priest is to modify a mass of the Holy Ghost to say over you, and they're to bless you in your endeavors. They have an active role in you succeeding. And that gets diminished a bit through the Elucidarium. While the Elucidarium still has a mass of the Holy Ghost that's to be said over your stuff, it doesn't need to be altered, which would have definitely been blasphemy in its time. And they don't have to pray over you for your success and such, but you still need holy water from them. You still need them to bless the priest to bless your incense and things like that. And it becomes less so in the Heptameron needing only holy water and a mass of the Holy Ghost. But nonetheless, this is all a characteristic of this particular lineage of Solomonic magic. It has a dominant role for a priest. And if you're going by the book, the priest will play an active role.
I love that you mentioned this because it ties in with my next question, which was to actually ask you to describe for us the flow of a normal ritual. See, this question comes from the fact that you observe a tendency and a trend in the magical community that right now magic is to be easy and simple. You just light a candle, say a few words, and your magic is done. Whereas now you're talking about cooperating with priests, getting holy water or blessing the incense from an actual priest. So in your tradition and in your practice, how does a ritual flow? And you mentioned also a purification period, getting divine permission. So a ritual is not just the conjuration or reciting the words, or it could be a month-long experience, if I'm not mistaken.
Or 40 days. Yep. Okay. So it depends on which form you're talking about. When you talk about the lineage of Liber Iuratus and the Elucidarium, the whole point of Elucidarium is to simplify. It is to dismiss the trifles of magic. And so as a result of that, you have major parts excluded. You're not working with the winds and the kings and the ministers, all of them, 100 some odd spirits. You're working with a king and his ministers, or just the ministers in the king's absence. Very simple, right? And so what a ritual looks like here, the Elucidarium simplifies, and in its simplification, it incorporates operational preparations from the Key of Solomon. The Key of Solomon would have been widely popular at its time, and whoever created the Elucidarium in roughly 1470-ish was trying to hitch on or incorporate part of the successes of the simplification or modular side of the Key of Solomon. And so we have preparations. We have the 9-day purification from the Key of Solomon, where the first 6 days you basically behave yourself. You withdraw, you prepare. And then the final 3 days you deal with fasting. In the whole time, you should have gone to Mass and received communion, confessed to a priest, abstinence and such. So you've got the 9-day from the key, the sword, the consecration of the sword. Well, that's not from the key. That's, the Mass of the Holy Ghost. You have the process of incense, and what you say over the incense kind of is from the Key of Solomon. What you say when you put on the garments is from the Key of Solomon. So sort of the initial steps that you do in beginning is almost all, in fact, I think it might all be from the Key of Solomon. But then when it's time to work with spirits, it's a simplification of Liber Iuratus. So you've got your circle, you've got your incense, you've got your robe on, and you've done all the Key of Solomon stuff, and you start basically naming the celestial hierarchy of the time. That comes from Liber Iuratus. And then, so you run down this hierarchy of the name and the hour, and the angel that rules the hour, and the angel that rules the day, and the ministers that rule the day, the name of the season, the name of the angels which rule in the season, the name of the sun in the season, the name of the moon in the season, and the name of the earth in the season. So you invoke all of those things. Then you come down further and you do a conjuration of the day, which essentially is a conjuration of the angel of the day, and all of the things attributed to that angel of the day, which is more angels, the overseers that rule in heaven, and the angel, and then you go down further. So you're going from like a real abstract, kind of like a big world picture of hierarchies, and you're getting down to the nitty gritty. From, you go from basically the hour to the day to the seasons, and then you get down to the angels in the heavens associated with the day, and you get down further. Essentially, then you cross the barrier to the terrestrial world and you call the king and his ministers, and then you do the conjuration from there on out. So that's what it looks like there. Ideally, he comes and you do the work and you send them on their way and you're done. But if you get to Liber Geratis, which would have been kind of the origin of all of this lineage, you have a much different story. You have to get permission in a dream before you even proceed. So you do this fasting and you say all these prayers that are attributed to the moon, depending on the day that the moon is in and whatnot, you say these prayers and you fast. And on the third day, you sleep and you'll have an angel appear in your dreams and give you permission to proceed or not. And if you don't get permission, then you start over, dream again until you do get permission. And then there's certain recommendations. It says to purify yourself and then try again. But you have to get that divine permission first. Once you have that divine permission, there's 20 days of purification that you go through, which include a 13-day fast.
Wow.
So, yeah. And from there, and the fast is not like a murder fast. It's not designed to like kill you. In fact, it even states that you can skip the fast so long as you're fasting every other day and you fast fully on the final 3 days. So when it mentions a fast, it doesn't mean that you're going the whole time without food. Even in those initial 3 days to get divine permission, you can eat after noon, one meal, but you can't eat anything else until noon the next day. So the fasting is not a really big, scary thing.
That's feasible.
Yeah. Once you pass this 20-day purification and it's time to begin, there's 3 days that precede the spirit work. On the first day, you go about and you kind of figure out where your circle is and you consecrate the space and you give an offering of burning incense. On the second day, you call the winds. And the winds are described as spirits that bring forth other spirits. And so all 7 kings have their own set of like 8 or so spirits, which are identified as the winds. So you stir the winds on the second day before the circle. So you call them all a million different ways. And then on the third day, before the work, you eat. Then you go about 3/4 of a mile away from your circle and you call the kings and you provoke them and you tell them to come. And so you should be manifesting spirits. And by the way, you're 3/4 of a mile away from your circle here. So you're agitating spirits and you're telling them to come. And then you go back to where your circle is, which has a bunch of names of God, 7 names of God written outside on paper or parchment or engraved into the earth, which protect your circle. So you go there and you call them again at your circle. And it's specifying here that you should be seeing things at this point, which you're still outside the circle here. So upon the end of the second call, you erase the names of God that protect your circle. You go inside your circle and you close it. And then you call them again. There's essentially 3 days of circle preparation where you're actually agitating and invoking and calling spirits outside of the circle, before you even go into the circle to continue. So you should have spirits manifesting around you before you're even inside your circle, which is a big thing, which is very different than what you see in the Lucidarium, because the Lucidarium, there's also 3 days of circle preparation, but nothing like this. Then when you're inside the circle and you call them again, then they start to appear and you begin the conjuration and the binding of the spirits. But here you're calling all the 7 kings and all of their ministers as well, and they should appear about the circle. Then you start working with the spirits at that point, and the whole getting them to appear in the manner that they should, and then doing the work with them as you intend to do, calling it good. But a good chunk of that happens outside the circle. There's a similar operation with working with angels, where you actually call the spirit into the circle. You're standing outside the circle and you call the angel into the circle. So the circle plays a very different role as well. I mean, it's there for protection, which is, it's clear in the works that it's a protective thing too. But the names that go inside the circle are the names of the angels of the time. And so while they do serve a protective role and you're conjuring them to protect you, they also serve as kind of, Joseph H. Peterson has put it, as a banner, like a parade, right? And so when you call an angel into a circle with these names around it, it's almost like a celebration in a way, as opposed to calling spirits outside the circle and you're protected by them in the manner of working with spirits. So very different.
That's a very important distinction that you make. It's not very common to hear about people calling spirits inside the circle and they're standing outside of it. And we're going to talk about the magic circle later on. And just a couple of things I want to highlight from your explanation is that there's this ritualization of life, basically, where your whole life becomes about that upcoming ritual. You're doing a 9-day period, or what amounts to a 40-day period. There's a structure, there's a fast, you get divine permission. So this goes really in contrast to what people are trying to accomplish today, which is 5-minute rituals and instant results. So I thank you for providing this much needed elaboration on the practices behind this, because we live in a fast-paced world and people are constantly looking for shortcuts. And I think it's very important that when you're looking to do something fully, that you have the commitment to go through with it, and not just think that, you're going to light a candle, say a few words of power, and the spirit will appear. That's not how things work in real life, in my opinion. So you've done all this, right? You've done all this. You've done the 9 days or the 30 days or 40 days purification. You've gotten the divine permission. You've contacted the spirits. You've done the whole ritual. Now you're preoccupied with success. I mean, did this work? Did they come? Right. And especially that not everybody's psychic sensitivity is at the same level. So in your experience, what are the most common signs of success in contacting and in treating the spirits that, yes, the request was accepted and that they're going to carry out the task?
So a lot of people ask this question, and a lot of people who are looking for experience, who are rather inexperienced themselves, which is, it's natural to know, like, hey, do these things really appear? If you look at the Heptameron, which again is a great pointing tool to look at and analyze because it's translated into English. If you look at the conjuration, the one that starts polite and then gets nasty, there's language used about, at first you call them, just to get them to come. But then the language changes. It's not that they're not there. It's that they're not in the proper form. It describes, that you'll see a lion devouring a girl, or you'll hear the sound of music and beating drums, or, all this chaotic stuff. And you're to reinforce your helpers that they'll be all right and to continue. And you take the chaos through more stern conjurations and you get them to appear in their proper sign, in the proper movement and sign. And that's the big phrase, movement and sign. And while we see that in the Heptameron in 1559, we see it in Liber Geratis as well. In fact, Geratis explains what the signs are. And the signs essentially are the initial signs that you have the proper spirit showing up. While some might think, the spirit should appear in a human form and whatnot, well, that would be a desirable end goal. This grimoire describes, like the spirits of the sun, there are signs and movements that you'll feel heat, that the hair on your back will stand up. And those are not things that you would associate necessarily, especially a beginner would associate with the arrival of a spirit. But the initial arrival of spirits appear to be very subtle. They're not just an in-your-face being that shows up and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to crap my pants now. You might just feel warm or feel cold or feel like a sudden fear, irrational fear, or something like that. And those are the initial signs that spirits have come. And if you look at the wording of the grimoires of like the Heptameron, it will go further. Once those show up, you go into more firm conjurations and you get them to appear in their true form, which may be fairly terrifying, but lastly, in a peaceful form. So the conjurations that you read are not just to get the spirits to come, it's to get them appear as they should. And that is sometimes necessary, though I would say very rarely. Again, keeping in mind that the goal here is to succeed, to do magic and get what you need done. While it would be fantastic to always have a full, peaceable form in front of you, sometimes it's not worth that because those conjurations get nasty. And if the goal is to delegate responsibly, especially if you already have a relationship with certain spirits. They don't need to prove themselves to you time and time again. Simply feeling heat on your back from a certain direction may be enough. Perhaps you want movement, or perhaps you want to see something or hear something. That's acceptable as well. Very rarely would you need to go to the point of full appearance. And full appearance is debatable throughout the history of grimoires too. I mean, drawing spirits into crystals, very popular grimoire. You know, it says right in the text that you should always work with more than one person, because where one person may not see a thing, another might. So it goes to show that just because you don't see the spirits doesn't mean that the spirits aren't there. But if you can recognize the subtle forms that they take upon arrival, you can get a lot more success out of that, because where one person might go, oh, I failed, you know, I don't see anything. In retrospect, all the science might have actually been there. They just didn't know what to look for.
That's very, very interesting that you mention these signs. And I thank you for taking the time, because that goes exactly in line with what we have in the Arabic tradition. Feeling a subtle heat, the hair on a part of your body, or feeling a certain tension on your left side. Like you said, sometimes it's your voice changing, you know, that you're going to start speaking out loud, or your tongue, you will feel some sensation. So these are all telltale signs of spirit presence. And as you said yourself, the spirits, after a while, and even in the beginning, they don't need to prove themselves to us. And having them appear in forms, that's more work that needs to be done for them and for us. So as you said before, if you are really interested in results and you're interested in getting what you ask for to be done, it's either that or concentrating on having experience. Would you say that?
Yeah. But there's value in both of those things. There is value in getting a spirit to actually appear, if not in a peaceable form, at least its true form, or even a recognizable subtle form. And to a part of that is validation as well. You know, you can validate that the right spirit is there, right kind of spirit is there. And so I certainly wouldn't diminish the advantage of experiencing a full appearance of a spirit, but I would diminish it in comparison of every time and the desire of working with success, you know? So yeah, if you could get a full visual appearance every single time, do it, great. But you have to make sure at what cost, for one, and two, you know, if you are taking it back to the diplomatic, you know, side of things, if you are trying to be a diplomat, do you really want to be an asshole every single time you work with these guys? You know, at what cost again? So yeah, there are pros and cons to it. For me, I do want visual appearance of some kind. It doesn't need to be a full body sitting in front of me, but I would like to see curtains move, or I'd like to see something out of the corner of my eye. And I will placate a lot. Like, you know, these steps of the conjuration, you know, you start nice. You don't just immediately go, you know, hey, are you there? Where are you at? You know, and then immediately go, okay, well, now I'm going to debase you, right? There needs to be some time. You need to give them time, you know? So I will placate the spirit and be like, okay, well, here's the incense. I burn the incense for you. Let me burn some more for you. Here, I'll go around the circle and burn even more for you. You know, I've done all these things for you. Where are you at? You know, like, oh, I feel kind of this atmospheric change. I may feel heat, or I feel coldness, but, you know, I'm doing these things for you. You could at least show yourself a little bit, you know, make a sound, or let me see, or move the curtain, or, you know, whatever. And as a result of that, you may get something like a shadow appear, or the curtain may move, or the candle may extinguish. Or, I mean, you may get things, you know, where I'll hear running water running, like a river was one of my biggest audible experiences. I swear to God, a river was running through my basement, or a small cloud in front of me that had lightning flashing inside of it. You know, the appearance of rain, like it looked like it was raining in a 3 foot by 3 foot spot, but it wasn't, you know. So you get those sort of things. And people will play up like this whole psychic ability, like being naturally a seer. Oh my God, if you can find a seer, work with a seer. Absolutely. The benefits are huge, but I am not a seer. I am not inclined to naturally let my imagination run wild. You know, I am 100% cognitive and lucid when I do my workings. I don't try to enter a trance state, and you get the results. So it comes with patience and skill. And overall time, working with these spirits time and time again.
Yeah, I agree. And it's all about building that relationship. We have to acknowledge that, especially when we first work with the spirit, that, it doesn't know us and it doesn't feel comfortable showing itself to us. So I think that speaks greatly of your experience and also the skill that you have developed and overall spirit communication that, as you said, you placate them. Like, I've given you the incense. I recited the nice conjurations. We could be great friends. So now it's time for you. I know you're here. Just
Right.
make the effort, right? As I'm making it for you. So now we're going to get to the question that connected me and Adley, and the question that got the idea for this interview to happen. Me and Adley discussing various things about the Heptameron and the Arabic tradition, we started to kind of make associations to the fact that these are the Jinn kings of the days that the whole Arabic tradition revolves around. And there are a lot of people making this argument out there. We're not saying that this is a definite fact, but I would like to ask Adley about his opinion coming from the Christian side of things and Western magic, post-Renaissance magic, and him exploring all these different traditions, what he has to say about the fact that these spirit kings of the days of the Heptameron are the Jinn kings of the days of the Arabic tradition.
Okay. So this question or this idea, I suppose, has been fairly taboo in kind of Western magic. And I don't know why. You're right that we have it's not like there's some manuscript that we know of that links Liber Iuratus spirits to some Persian manuscript or other Arabic source or something. That has not been discovered. There is no real official link between the two. But I don't think it's a bold opinion to state that the spirits are the same. And here's why. Despite the fact of that missing link is not there, if we just look at reason, what's the reasonable conclusion? We can acknowledge a few things. First, the names. The names are strikingly similar. And while some people may look at spelling and go, these look nothing alike, a lot of them exist in similarity phonetically when you say them. Strikingly, Barkon, for example, that's the same. You have Sarabotres, and all of these spirits, they have this remarkable similarity between them, between what you see in kind of the Arabic side versus what you see in Liber Iuratus. And I mentioned Liber Iuratus explicitly because that's the earlier text that we have. We know it existed prior to the others, rather. And Liber Iuratus, regarding the manuscript, the earliest manuscript we have is the 16th century, but there is evidence of it existing somewhere between the 12th and 13th century. So we know it was around then. And we can see the corruption between just the Elucidarium, between the names that we see from a 1525-ish manuscript and the 1559 manuscript, or a very careful copy from 1569 of an earlier manuscript. And we can see an evolution of corruption that takes place in just 60 years or 50 years. And to say, knowing that the manuscript we have of Iuratus is a 16th century, what the corruption looked like prior, it is within my personal expectations to see the corruption of names that we see between the Arabic side and the Western side. If we acknowledge the fact that this circulated in the Mediterranean area, that we have Constantinople that was constantly bombarded by Persians ultimately, that it was a melting pot of Arabic influence, that it should be expected to see these kind of things. I mean, if it's no shock to us that we see Hebrew influence in a Markava type of tradition within Liber Iuratus, it should be no surprise that we see Arabic influence there as well. So if we acknowledge that, if we acknowledge the fact that Albuni references certain incenses for each of these kings, and 3 of the 7 incenses are the same in Geratis, matched with the names that we see in Geratis and the similarities there. The fact that they align with the day, that these spirits rule the day. It's not hidden in Geratis that the emphasis is the day, the king of the day. The incense is not the incense of the planet. It's the incense of the day pertinent to the king. If we look at all of these things, the reasonable conclusion is that these are the same spirits. The argument that I hear from some is, well, they share the same names, they're not the same spirit. And I mean, that's a speculative argument, and there'll never be proof. And at some point, we have to ground ourselves in the reasonable side. And well, we don't have that missing link, which solidifies that, yes, this came from this Persian manuscript or this lost manuscript in Constantinople or something. If we look at the facts that we know, it all points pretty firmly to the idea that these 7 kings of the day are indeed the 7 kings of the day. So yeah, I don't think it's a bold opinion. A lot of people do, though.
I am someone who's pretty vocal about it, but it is definitely not far-fetched, and there are strong arguments for it, if not only historical. And as you said, the incense, and there's only one Monday. So logically, right, there can only be one king ultimately responsible for Monday. But what really does it for me is the names. It's just so close, especially that one of them is actually exactly the same as Maymun. Maymun, we say Maymun. And also the pairings between the angels and the jinns and the spirits. So it is the same spirits with the same planets and the same angels. So I mean, how many more correspondences do you want, right?
Yeah, it holds a strong argument, even if it is speculative. It's about as strong as a speculative argument gets, in my opinion.
Definitely. I have the excellent website that you mentioned before, Mr. Joseph Peterson, and I'm looking here at the diagram that is with the Heptameron. You have Barkan at Mercury, so it is the same, exactly the same. Barkan at Mercury. We have Maymun for Saturday, same thing. Sarabotres, we have Zoba, which is with corruption between.
That's still close.
Yeah, within a Semitic and a non-Semitic language, that's as close as it gets. And we have Yamash. So Yamash, we say Al-Ahmar, but in some, here it says Hali 14b36, they name him Hamaz, so which is very, very close to what we have on Tuesday as Al-Ahmar. And Monday we have Al-Mudahab. So Mudahab is the golden king, we have him for the sun, but here he's on Monday. So sometimes, as you said, sources and manuscripts don't agree between each other, but this should not detract from the fact that these spirits are the same. Names change, or maybe someone puts them at this day or that day from their personal experience, but in all cases, approximately the same 7 angels with the same 7 spirits. And I definitely think it's not far-fetched. So this is something that is coming more into light into the magical community. So if you have never heard it, you've heard it here first. And as I said, I'm pretty vocal about it. Adley is, he's not stating this as a fact. I think it's very important for us to make that distinction, but we're raising a case that this could be something that is valid.
Yeah, I would argue, I would go so far as to say it is valid. And there's some really strong points that you'd have to make a hell of a case against to really argue against all of those things. Speculative nonetheless, but as about as cement as speculation can get, in my opinion.
Definitely, especially when we started, just the other day comparing incenses, and we found out that, especially because incense is a very important part of magic. So when you say, okay, these spirits like this sort of incense, like these are the same spirits. They're not opposed or they're not strangers to each other. So I think that is the final nail in the coffin to that assumption, and it started being a fact. So I am glad that you're in support of this idea, and I'm glad also to see people from other traditions, cultures agree with me on that. So Thank you for taking the time to shed light on your perception on that subject, Adley. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem.
So this actually bridges on to my next question, because we're dealing with unseen spirits, very, very powerful spirits in the case of the Heptameron and Liber Juratus. What are the dangers of magic as it stands? You see, most people are unaware of, because I see people do things sometimes, overlook some steps, and I'm like, my God, they just don't understand the ramifications of their overlookings.
So I'm not one to judge too much for beginners. As the actual operator of someone who's running the circle, even if you're by yourself, you're the one in the least amount of danger, in my opinion. It's when you have others around you that things can go awry. So, if you're by yourself and you're operating, you're going from the get-go with the authority, you are in the least amount of danger. If you step outside the circle, or you forget to close the circle, or, there's not much, honestly, in that time necessarily that can go awry. In my experiences, it's when other people are around that things can get particularly nasty. And even then, in my personal experiences, nasty has not been terrible, not like anyone's dying or anything. There's been pinches on certain targets, things inside the circle. There's been physical happenings afterwards, like cars won't start, things like that. But nothing that's like, life-threatening type of danger during the actual operation that I've ever experienced. Now, I think the worst thing that can happen is the worst place to make shortcuts, or the worst place to get sloppy, is in the petition. When you're actually working with the spirit and you say what you want, I think that is the part that you need to be most careful about, and the part where actual danger can happen. And it's not that you can just get hurt inside the circle. It's what are you agreeing to? If you need $1,500 and you just say, hey, I need $1,500, I need it in like a month, snap, that right there can be reckless. And there are a lot of terrible things that can get you $1,000 in a month that can happen. And so you need to be careful during the petition explicitly to be sure that you specify what you want, how you want it, and how you don't want it. And all of those things are important. And not necessarily for the sake of being cautious, but also for the sake of success. If I want $1,000, but I don't want to be harmed, I don't want my family harmed or my property harmed, I don't want to lose my job, or I don't want to involve insurance, right? Those are all good things that help protect you. But if your list continues, I don't want charity, and I don't want blah, 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 and you put so many things out there that make it impossible to fulfill the request, that you're already dooming yourself to failure. So you don't want to be so cautious that you doom yourself to failure before you are even done. But you don't want to be so reckless that you doom yourself to harm before you're even done. You need to be very well thought out in particularly this part of the spirit working. So that's really where I would put that emphasis.
This is something that I've discussed with some of my students. You don't want to be too vague, and you don't want to be too precise, because you're basically either opening too many doors or closing too many. And if you're too precise, like you said, I don't want charity, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want that, at some point you're working against yourself. So you want to give them some lenience to work with, but you also want to make sure that you're protecting yourself. So and even there are some conjurations that it's basically written in, do this and do that without hurting me and my family, or so some people don't understand. And I remember even myself as a beginner, I didn't really understand, but now I understand, with the experience, why they put those things in the conjurations, where it's not just about the petition and what you're doing in your business with the spirit, it's actually included in the conjuration for your safety. So talking about safety, this goes on to my next question. The magic circle. We briefly talked about it before, where as you said, basically you conjure outside and inside, whereas for some people it's like the magic circle is basically life and death, right? Whereas you're safe only within and everything has to stay without. So what is, to you, in your experience and research, what is the true meaning of the magic circle?
I think the magic circle in its deepest form is a barrier. Not necessarily one of protection, though that's definitely probably the most common use for it, but also in the example of Uratus and conjuring angels into the circle or over the circle, one of celebration, or one of kind of distinguishing a holy place within a consecrated place. The grounds of which you're doing your work is consecrated, and then a circle is there, and the banner of celestial names that are in that circle, you conjure an angel into that circle. That is more of a celebratory thing. I mean, there could be, don't get me wrong, there could be some protective cases there as well. There is a barrier between you and it. There are the biblical stories, the Hebrew stories, where angels have slaughtered armies. They're not exactly peaceful and blissful, and they can be terrifying as well. So there could be some degree of protection there separating you from it too. But in that example, you're standing outside the circle, conjuring a spirit into it. In another example, where you're working with spirits, you're actually calling spirits, nearly a full mile away from your circle. And to say that you are without protection, then I wouldn't say so much, because you've gone through your purification. You've had a priest bless your workings. You have divine permission to do your workings. So it's not that big of a deal to be nearly a mile away from your circle, conjuring up the winds and stirring up the seven kings. Then you also have the fact that you've got your circle, which has the protective names of the angels of the times. And outside of that, you have 7 names of God written around your circle as well, in a circle. And that protects you from spirits. And you have to erase those names before you can see the spirits. So there is also some fluidity to the degree of protection. So yeah, in my experience, I think I would say predominantly it is protective. But I don't think that's necessarily the only case for it.
That is very, very interesting that you said you have to erase the names to see the spirits, because as you mentioned, it is a barrier. So it's not only kind of energetic barrier, it's also a psychic barrier for us to not be able to perceive them, or them not be able to project their being through the circle. So this is very, very interesting. And you maybe have heard it here first, that the magic circle, about its protective barriers, and it's not all set in stone that you have to stay within. As you said, you're conjuring spirits sometimes nearly a full mile away, and then kind of luring them to where you are going to perform the ritual, and then you stand into your circle. There's a process of erasing the names, writing different names, angels' names. So again, not everything is set in stone, and I'm happy that you have elaborated on that. So we're touching towards the end of our interview, and these are basically just some questions for the people who are looking to get into magic, but they don't really know what they're starting. And also, we want to help people leverage your knowledge and experience for them to make a good advancement and give them the right shortcuts. So these questions are aimed at doing that. So my next question is, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see people making when working Solomonic magic?
Downplaying the significance of the baseline, which we spoke to earlier, that these grimoires are a starting point, and they may not necessarily reflect the end practice that you'll have, but they are a baseline to measure your progress against. So downplaying the significance of following the instructions there is one that I would call a mistake. If you're following a book that says you need, black cat's blood to consecrate your tool, then you should find a way to do that. Not condoning killing a cat, but there's people that I've seen who have taken blood from a vet from their cat and things like that. So there's ways to safely do it. Same with like the brass vessel of the Goetia. Father Ashton Chassan has a black rooster that he takes the blood from a vet. So you can do it without death. So following the rules, for one. If something is too hard, a lot of people will just find another way to do it or disregard it altogether. That's a problem. Those are mistakes that I would definitely call out. And, people are intimidated by how difficult some of this work is. And I would say from experience, it is, if you do it one step at a time, carefully, well thought out, it's not that hard. There are challenges, but they can be overcome. just one step at a time. You don't have to do it overnight. Just one step at a time. It can be done. The other thing is, like the Key of Solomon has so many requirements for its tools, different kinds of bloods, inks as well with Agrippa. And I know that the blood in the inks were oftentimes a thickening agent. And so people will kind of argue with themselves and say, oh, it's not really needed because we don't need to thicken it with blood. We have these other stuff. And, there's argument for that. But disregarding that baseline, it's too hard shortcuts. Those are the big mistakes that a lot of new people will make. And I would discourage anyone from making those. Reach out to people who have done the work and ask them, because if they've done the work, they've done it, they'll have insight.
And this is exactly what I'm trying to accomplish by asking you these questions, is to give people these insights from someone who has actually worked the system and gone through the whole process. And I hope that the listeners are paying close attention. The process is important. It is not just getting the success and getting the results, but there is wisdom behind that process. And I mean, most magicians are pure pragmatists. They will not tell you to do something that doesn't need to be done. That's only my impression from what you're describing about Liber Iuratus and the Heptameron. So I think you're making a great point about people rushing through the steps and, disregards too many rules because they're there for a reason. And the next question is about something that a lot of people ask, and it's on a lot of people's minds, is that, we're just normal human beings. We're living a normal life. And then we try to work magic and contact spirits. And especially when a lot of people, they trying to deal with very authoritative figures within the hierarchy. And they wonder, well, how does one go to prove themselves to the spirit? Before asking for the spirits to prove themselves to us, a lot of people have to prove themselves, and also to gain the kind of authority to exert obedience from them, because that is ultimately what we're trying to do. And you mentioned about the conjurations, but are there any other steps that one has to do on their own or that are not mentioned in the books explicitly?
That depends on the book. When it comes to the Elucidarium, it's very thorough, very practical and to the point. There's nothing really there that's like overlooked. There's definitely things that you can learn from its predecessor, the Elucidarium, that help elaborate things that are not clearly stated, but most everything can be deduced there, not intentionally, like leaving anything out. Iuratus is incredibly thorough. So is SSM, incredibly thorough. So there's not necessarily anything there. When it comes to the authority, right? Again, I would go to the delegate and the diplomatic side of things here, that you are a diplomat in and of yourself, of God, in the Christian theology of the hierarchy of the angels and spirits, that you are a diplomat of God. You've gained divine permission. You've been blessed by the priest and the church, and you've been purified too. There is a stature of authority that you have to command spirits or command angels, even command angels who not subordinate to you, but are subordinate to God, who is enforcing that you're his right hand at this time. So it's not that you are like going around bossing angels around and saying, hey, angel, mighty Michael, I need you to beat up this lowly spirit so that he brings me money. That's not really what you're doing. So there's a lot to it, especially when it comes to that hierarchy.
Something very important that you say, it's not just Retta or Adley bossing these angels around and telling them to do this or do that, and even bossing the spirits around. All the authority and all the power comes from God. That all ties into getting divine permission, because if you overlook that step and then you get to the point where you need to rely on divine authority and you didn't have his permission, well, that's that's on
and
you.
That's a part that gets excluded in a lot of work, like the Heptameron and the Elucidarium. It doesn't have getting the dream and divine permission. And so it makes a method a little bit easier, perchance maybe a higher degree of failure, But nonetheless, you still go through a process of purification, and you still have these prayers and confessions that you make, and prayers petitioning God and praying to God that his angels help you in this matter and reinforce your will on this matter. And so there's still, you're not by yourself. There is still this celestial and religious side to it.
That's very interesting. So to the next question, we've spoken about the mistakes. We've spoken about building one's authority. And what is your most important piece of advice for our listeners?
I would say the two biggest pieces of advice that I could give. One, we've already spoken to, which is how important it is to take care during your petition. Your wording matters. The other part would be your patience in the actual conjuration, that you take your time going through this. Geratis in its conjurations, it'll say, oh, you call them 9 times, and why 9 is because you'll be too discouraged after 9 times to continue successfully, at which point you just try tomorrow, And some people, I know Skinner has been adamant about repeating your conjurations, sometimes 7 times because of the 7 orders of the heaven and the planets. So repeating the conjurations, taking your time, placating, using that to your advantage before going to the next step. The last place you want to end up is yelling at a spirit and trying to debase it and whatnot. You don't want to go there. You'll be prepared to go there if you have to, but you don't want to go there. And if things aren't going well, placate into the spirit, feed their ego a bit, burn more incense for them. I go so far as to have a chair set outside of my circle, and I will invite them to sit at the seat, sit at this chair that I prepared for you. Like your friend in avoiding the nasty conjurations, which you'll get to if you're not careful, is placating the spirits. So those are the 2 points that I would say. Take your time in your conjuration, repeat your conjurations, placate the spirits in between your conjurations, even in between your repetitions of the conjurations, and be very cautious about what you're saying to the spirits, because success and failure ride on that.
Very, very important pieces of advice there. And for me, when you say repetition of the conjuration, this is something that's standard in the Arabic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Like we use conjurations, and they're going to tell you, you're going to repeat this 7 times, or you're going to repeat it 21 times, or you're going to repeat it 33 times. So it's not something that is debatable, or I think this is something that comes from your experience, but also something that has a very, very valid argument for it in magic. And also, as you said, the patience. When you say to a spirit to do something, or to ask for a sign, or to appear, or whatever, you have to be patient. It's only through Hollywood movies that you say something and it happens right away. I mean, in real life, the spirit does things on its own time. That's really it. So those are great pieces of advice for practitioners of all levels. Now, being mindful for people who have never lit a candle. They want to get into magic. They want to work magic. They're interested in magic. They're still learning and researching. They're kind of on the fence. What advice would you give them to actually, I would say, even shortcut their success so they can leverage your knowledge and your experience?
I think anyone who has some experience in magic can attest that there is never a time where you're prepared to start. If you're waiting till you have all the tools, till you have the ritual memorized, you're going to be waiting forever for that perfect time to come. Don't wait forever. I think someone who is looking for experience, who wants to work, that it's more forgivable to not have the proper tools in order to gain the experience of doing the work, because there's honor in that as well. I would say don't sit around waiting forever. You will be unprepared. You will always be unprepared. Half of the magicians out there who practice regularly, there are still times that we're unprepared. So that's just a pill you're going to have to swallow.
Yep, definitely. I can only imagine, in your case, the first time that you had to work on a waning moon, or that you like sometimes I have to break my own rules because I have to do something and I don't really have the time, or things are working against me in a certain way. So I totally
Mhm.
agree. We're not always prepared. And a lot of people, they're trying to wait for that moment when they feel 100% confident, right? That they're
Yeah.
doing everything right and that it will surely work. But I don't think that moment actually ever arrives in magic. And even more than that, I think it's not even wise to be 100% confident. I think it's always good to err on the side of caution when we're doing things, because you don't want to be arrogant and start making mistakes.
There is a real benefit to getting the experience. And a good example is, the little mishaps can happen in ritual. A good example is, I was working with some helpers, and in the middle of the process of casting the circle and working with the incense and whatnot, one of the helpers fainted. And we had to deal with bringing a chair. We had to go outside the circle. We had to bring a chair. We had to make sure that she was healthy, water and cognizant, figure out what the problem was. But part of the ritual had already been done at that point. But having the experience of doing this 1,000 times, you knew what needed redone and what didn't. We had to go outside the circle, so the circle had to be redone. But the incense was already blessed, so we don't have to go back and bless the incense again, and we don't have to go back and do certain prayers. So having the experience, even if it's ill prepared, having the experience means having certain knowledge. And had I not done rituals 100 times, there may have been some downfalls that got overlooked in that if I didn't know what the process was intimately. So yeah, get the experience and don't wait around forever.
That's really what differentiates the people who actually get the results and become accomplished in their practice to the people who don't ever get anywhere. So this concludes our questions. Now, I want to ask you, Adley, you've given us so many perspective changing insights from your extensive research and rich experience. A lot of people now are wondering, well, where can we find Adley? Because I know you have a shop where you sell various magical implements, magical materials. You have several Facebook groups. So please tell our listeners where they can find you.
Sure. Probably the best place to get active and learn is going to be that Heptameron Facebook group. You would need Facebook for it, but if you search the Heptameron and a Lucidarium, that's the one. You'll find us there. There's tons of info there, tons of breakthroughs there, lots of collective teamwork there. If you're looking for me explicitly, don't friend me on Facebook. I keep my magic stuff and my personal stuff separate. So if you friend me on Facebook, you're just going to see a bunch of me cooking steaks and grilling and smoking and, doing all the fun things that I like to do. If you want to know about my magic, find my Adley's Magic Facebook page. There you'll see the stuff you're interested in. Beyond that, adleysmagic.com is where my shop is. My focus has always been the late medieval period. So you're going to find late medieval stuff there. You're going to find Sephiroth incenses there. You're going to find a variety of candles, conjuration candles that are based on the Heptameron or Lucidarium. You're going to find altar candles. Like I've got these gorgeous 14.5-inch beeswax pillar candles that I've got now, and all handmade stuff. Pentacles, for those who are interested in pentacles, services and classes are all available there. And that's just adleysmagic.com.
Yep. And I can speak to the quality and the reputation that you have within the magical community. And the last thing you mentioned is classes. So for the people who are looking to learn, I personally don't know. There might be some out there, but I personally don't know of a better teacher for anybody who is looking to get immersed in pre-Renaissance magic and to explore the full richness of traditions and ancient grimoires like the Lucidarium Necromantiae and the Liber Iuratus. So once again, Adley, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and for your advice I really appreciated this, and it's all to the benefit of our listeners. So once again, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, not a problem. Thanks for having me on.
Well, there you have it, dear listeners. Getting important clarifications, breaking down misconceptions, and bridging the gap between traditions. That's what we're all about here at AHM. I don't know about you, but personally, this interview has opened my eyes to different perspectives and new horizons. And I'm humbled to have a guest such as Adley, who is not only well studied, but is also willing to share the knowledge he accumulated through his extensive research and experience, all to the benefit of our supporters. And I hope that you have found it as fascinating as I did. Now, if you want to know when the next one will air, subscribe to the channel and make sure you hit that notification bell. Also, I don't know if you like this, Adley neither. So if you did, let us know by hitting that thumbs up button and leaving your thoughts in the comment section down below. You're already looking forward to the next one? Subscribe to my Patreon to see it first and gain access to exclusive patron-only content. You're interested in learning more about Arabic magic? Start by joining the thriving community on Facebook. The group's name is Arabic Theurgy and Magic. And check out my Patreon, where I teach about Arabic magic. You'll find the link in the description down below. Lastly, I want to express my sincere gratitude to every single one of our patrons whose support makes this podcast possible. Thank you to every single one of you, and may God's peace and blessings be upon you. Ma'as salama, and see you all on the next one.